Hej och välkomna till det här samtalet med tidskriften Jacobins grundare Bhaskar Sunkara. Vi kommer att prata lite om media, om Jacobin och om vårt politiska klimat just nu, tänker jag. Welcome, Bhaskar Sunkara.
Thanks for having me.
Nice to finally see you. I do read your magazine a lot,
That's
and
great.
I really enjoy it. I was thinking this conversation is going to be partially about the magazine, but also about the current political climate.
Sure.
And I'd say my first question is, as leftists or socialists, we're often accused of increasing polarization. I don't know if you recognize this, but right? So we're seen as living in a time of extremes, where on the one hand you have right-wing extremists, and on the other hand you have kind of left-wing extremists. And the people who are usually blamed for that are people like Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, and so on. But I've been thinking, first of all, do you think this is an accurate representation of our time? And second of all, if it is, doesn't increased polarization maybe help the left?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are living in a time where it's clear that the center, the liberal center, doesn't actually have solutions to the problems of our age. And we're also in a period where people have recognized that they've been in the middle of a slow-moving offensive against their standards of living, against their right to dignity and security and whatever else. And obviously people are angry and they're looking for alternatives. And some of that anger is happening on the right and is directed in a very negative way. It's directed at scapegoating immigrants, it's directed at scapegoating racial minorities and whatever else. And I think unless we on the left can credibly speak to anger and can speak with our own set of solutions, then we'll just cede that ground, that anti-establishment ground, to the right. So I would say that it is my hope to, through my work, increase polarization in society. But the polarization that I want to increase is between the interests of the vast majority against the interests of a tiny minority that benefit from people's continued exploitation and oppression. Then again, I think that what's often lost from this dichotomy of just there's the extreme right and the extreme left and they're the same thing, is that as leftists we aren't anti-liberal. In other words, we look at the Enlightenment dream of liberty, of equality, of solidarity, and we say that capitalism both makes possible and frustrates these dreams. We actually want to realize them. So we ask deeper questions that will, in the end, resolve social conflict in such a way that it'll lead to the emancipation of all people, whereas the right just gives us tribalism and a regression to even more backward forms of life and living. So I do think there's a fundamental difference between the two.
That's interesting. We're not anti-liberal. In what sense, do you think?
Well, I think to be a leftist is to ask questions like, let's say you're in India. You would say the liberal right, the right that's been won to a free press is a right we defend. But to be a leftist is to ask deeper questions of what does it mean to have a free press when 40+% of the population is functionally illiterate? What does it mean to guarantee formal legal equality when so much of life outcomes in the world is a result of accidents of birth? But the actual, I think, dream of the most radical wing of the Enlightenment is a dream that we should uphold and that we believe in. But at the same time, we see that even though capitalism has made possible with the abundance that it creates, all this wealth around us, it's also frustrated the possibilities that abundance gives us to live in a world without scarcity, without the war of all against all.
How do we as leftists speak to people's anger without falling into the usual traps of scapegoating, for example?
Well, I think we do want to at least have, I think anger has to have a target. So I think that I think can speak a simple truth. And I think the point of theory, the point of of any sort of rhetoric or politics is actually to simplify an infinitely complex reality. So our message to people is, you work hard and you're not getting enough. And the reason why you're not getting enough isn't because of immigrants or minorities, it's because of, in Sanders' rhetoric, millionaires and billionaires who profit from your continued suffering. And I think that message is strong and powerful. And the message to tell people it's not your fault. If you're dealing with difficulties, it's not the result of your personal failings. It's not just in a vague sense society's fault. It's the fault of a tiny minority of people that benefit from the situation that you're kept in. And in a sense, that's a simplification. But I think there's a broader truth to it, and it's a compelling, simple narrative that you could build a much more complex and nuanced politics, that it will involve policies and lots of intricate details. But I think just like the right has a simple message, the left has to have a simple, clear, and comprehensible message.
So why do you think that in this time it's in many ways simpler to blame, for example, immigration than that tiny minority?
Well, I think it depends where. So in the United States, it's actually interesting in which there's been a shift to the left on immigration that you wouldn't quite perceive if you just pay attention to Donald Trump's rhetoric and the rhetoric of the minoritarian kind of leadership in the White House. In 1994, around 28 to 30% of Americans said that immigration was a good thing, and 61% said that immigrants were a burden. Today, the numbers are almost flipped, with the majority of Americans think that immigration is a good thing. Majority of Americans even want to see the level of legal immigration increase. And this is true if you break it's Pew polling, so it's like a reputable polling, but if you break it down across educational attainment levels, which at least in the US is a very good proxy for class, because there's no, in the census form, they're not asking you, are you a proletarian or not? But it holds true across different income brackets. Numbers are slightly lower among white Americans, but still a polarity of white Americans have positive views of immigration. And I think that's sometimes lost in this broader narrative. And what workers are actually perceiving is that, politics and the economy is not, a zero-sum game. But the situation is different in different countries. So we can't just rest our defense of immigration on the fact that in most contexts, immigrants produce far more wealth than they take from the welfare state, and that the economic gains of having immigration more often than not offsets any competitive pressures on certain low-wage parts of the labor market. Because that's true in the US, and I think workers perceive that it's true, and the union movement has been pretty good in the US at least since the 80s, rejecting kind of populist rhetoric around immigration. It's not always true in every situation. It's kind of an empirical question, and obviously I think the left defense of immigration has to be on a moral basis, especially as it relates to refugees as opposed to economic migration. So economic migration obviously is easy to address and has certain limits. People are coming because there's availabilities in a job market. Then presumably when the labor market gets to, when there's not those jobs available, people will go elsewhere. And also when people are employed in a country as workers, they're creating, in Marxist terms, they're creating surplus, right? It's not a zero-sum game. But often that can't be the same for refugees, so obviously we need a moral rhetoric too. So I think that it just depends on the country, the context, and whatever else, but the main job of the left should be to, everywhere, battle against the narrative of scarcity and push the idea that there's enough to go around. And in countries where immigration's a very important issue, and it's an issue that's generally benefiting the right, Our goal should be to win over voters, not by capitulating on our core principles on the issue of immigration, but rather on being so credible on the issues in which we're better than the right, that voters would support us regardless. So if immigration is someone's number one priority, it should be our goal to make it their number three priority, and to be so credible on jobs, on defending the welfare state, on whatever else, that they say, I don't like everything the left party says about migration, or that doesn't strike me as exactly right, but they're by far the best on these other issues, so I'm going to vote for them anyway. I don't think that's the basis on which you want cadre, in your organization thinking, but I think as far as winning over voters, it's a lot better than a anti-racist rhetoric that's primarily moralistic and seeks to change people's consciousness before actually being credible on other issues. I think we have a lot more leverage to change people's kind of moral or ethical set of ideas about something if we're already credible organizers and defenders of their interests.
Okay.
So I gave you a lot.
No,
I didn't pause,
that's
dude.
really interesting. No, it's really interesting. I was thinking about Jacobin the magazine. And would you say that the aims of Jacobin is kind of speaking to the left, or is it supposed to have a broader reach? Mm-hmm. Is it about changing the political climate in favor of the left?
So yeah, I think it's two discrete aims. One was an intra-left goal. When Jacobin was founded in late 2010, early 2011, the left was very much in the United States in kind of a change the world without taking power, kind of very anarchistic moment. And the anarchist movement in the US, of course, is much and even worse than the anarchist movement in Europe. There was no great defenses of Barcelona or whatever else. It was just food co-ops and urban gardens and whatever in the US, at least in the last 100 years. And I think part of the intra-left goal was a defense of some of the traditional forms of left-wing organizing, at least saying that the mass party and the trade union are still the way in which the majority of working class victories have been won. And there's no credible evidence that those forms are completely extinct, so we should try to renovate and make those ideas relevant to changing circumstances. So we still, in other words, believed in the working class as the agent of change, and the agent of that would end not just exploitation but all forms of oppression. And in so many ways we were like the new old left. We were more orthodoxly Marxist, but at the same time we were more accessible, comprehensible. So if you don't need to have read Adam Smith to read The Economist, you shouldn't have to have read Karl Marx to read Jacobin. But along the same lines, our other project was directed at the broader political mainstream, and this is probably where we've been our most successful, which is just simply articulating a set of politics, calling it democratic socialism or socialism like we do in the US, and saying that this is the opposition to liberalism, that we are contrasting ourselves in the politics of the center, even the politics of the center-left, with the politics of left. It has a history, it has a past, it'll hopefully have a future here, but let us remind you of the history, but making kind of coherent politics and putting a name on it. Then waiting for the center to collapse and sputter like it did in 2016, and then there was a ready-made alternative for people. So we reach around 1 to 1.2 million people online every month. Around only 55% of them are actually in the US. We have like 15% in the UK and then dispersed around the world. So, but there's not 600,000 leftists in the hard, Marxist socialists in the US. So, our reach is broader, but also we've been able to engage in debates with mainstream liberals and others by adopting at least some of their terms or style of debate. So we have people who could do statistical analysis, who could debate healthcare policies at a empirical level of minutia, but don't lose sight of the fact that our primary goal at the moment is not to write policy, but rather to change the conditions in which policy is written. And I would say I'm much more interested in kind of the reaching the broader audience than just the intro-left debate. But I think there's room to do both at the same time, often in the same publications. So if I write something, it might be an intervention on the left, if you know the subtext, but it also at the same time should be clear and comprehensible enough that people who aren't on the left at all can read it and have some sort of takeaway without it being excessively didactic. Because on the other hand, a lot of our publications, socialist publications, always end with the same 2 paragraphs. You know, that's why we need the working class party or whatever else. And obviously, good writing is more of a a glancing blow than a direct hit to the face.
You mentioned history. Is part of Jacobin's mission to also, I'm thinking about the history of resistance. Is that part of what you try to do? Showing that there's a history of resistance from the left?
Yeah, I think that's definitely some of what we try to do. Remind people that they're part of a tradition, and a tradition with certain norms. So, and I think some of those things are important, right? So in the U.S., there's not even the culture of, or at least like the culture even of like not crossing picket lines and things like that. We're fading just because of the lack of the defeat of the trade union movement of the left. So part of what we try to do is talk about the history of resistance and the fact that class struggle is not foreign to the U.S. In many ways, throughout the 19th century, it was among the most violent seats of class struggle in the world. But I think the more interesting question is not that people resist, but rather trying to explain why people don't resist. In other words, capitalism is more marked by stability than its crises, in that it's prone to crises but has built-in mechanisms for responding to and stabilizing the crises. And Marxists have traditionally looked at the fact they have their historical agent, this proletariat, and they have this antagonist, but there's not constant high levels of class struggle or resistance. In fact, more often than not, there isn't. And they try to explain this through a variety of ways, and a common approach is to think about false consciousness, or the idea that it must be something in culture or something like this is worked people's minds and they no longer understand their class interests. But instead, I think it's as simple as people are smart and they're rational, and they know that in most situations, collective action is a risky choice, and it's a choice that has consequences if you fail, because capital and labor are dependent on each other, but it's an asymmetrical dependency. Any individual worker needs their boss more than a boss needs an individual worker. So I think that one of the goals of Jacobin is to offer enough sobriety that even in moments of where there isn't resistance, where there isn't a kind of an upsurge on the left, we can see our mission as trying to create the infrastructures of dissent that can make collective action a more viable choice for ordinary people, instead of, I think, what the left sometimes does, which is a type of voluntarism that says that if they're not with us, they won't ever be, we'll have to form a moral and committed small minority of people and storm the barricades ourselves. And that often leads to the kind of substitutionism that the US left was very prone to. We always had lots of leftists, and they were always extremely brave and morally committed, but in such a way that kind of didn't make sense. Like in 1917, Oklahoma had probably the strongest socialist party in the country, one of the strongest socialist parties in the country. and that state was the seat of massive worker unrest, and like it was a big source of strength for the left. Today, of course, it's remembered as a completely reactionary red state. One of the reasons why it became a red state was that a year later, when the U.S. entered the World War I, the party in Oklahoma held to an even more extreme anti-war position than the Bolsheviks and others in Europe, and that they said that rather than make war on their workers in a different country, they would immediately declare war on the U.S. government. They got a bunch of weapons. They started kind of marching, trying to start a rebellion in the state, and they were just crushed by paramilitary and state forces almost immediately. And to this day, on the legal statutes in Oklahoma, it's not legal to fly a red flag. But it's never been tested in court, because I don't think anyone's ever been arrested on that basis. It wouldn't hold up in court. So maybe that's something to do. If it's a fun activity, we could all go to Oklahoma and fly red flags.
So what would you say is the recipe for success for a left-wing publication?
I think, to be honest, this is a very bourgeois answer, but you have to have a sustainable model to bring in enough revenue that you survive till the next day. And most publications are relying on foundations, on grants and whatnot, which means that you spend money to beg people to give you more money. Jacobin is built on a subscriber-based model, so our goal is to reach readers, and through reaching readers, we generate the revenue that we need to reach more readers. And obviously the details get complicated, but I think it's as simple as that. Like having there's no such thing as left-wing accounting or right-wing accounting. Either the numbers add up or they don't. I think the same way also with things like design, with presentation, there's no such thing as left-wing design or right-wing design. There's just, is it confident? Is it laid out correctly? Is it, do people take pride in what they do at even an apolitical level? So I think those basics are very important. Then obviously you need to have an audience, but I think one should edit and produce what you think you would read yourself, and hope that you're either not so generic or bland that it's not going to distinguish itself, but also not so like weird and niche and insular that you're not going to have enough of an audience. And I think there's obviously there's some middle ground, but I don't think there's a clear-cut formula. I do think that there's certain technical things that people underestimate, because they think that the idea itself will be enough, that to be right is vindication in and of itself, and that vindication will find rewards in the wider world. But I don't think that's the case in life or in publishing. So
a sustainable model, subscriber-based.
It's different in different language markets. Yeah. So in Sweden, I would probably have a different approach, but I have the benefit of 330 million people, and then the UK.
And then also a good balance between an intra-left while simultaneously speaking to a broader audience, maybe.
Yeah, I think that part can be done anywhere, but I guess the question is, if you're producing journalism and you're producing valuable work for a smaller language market, whether it's possible to do what Jacobin does, which is essentially we reach hundreds of thousands of people online, and then we convert around 2 to 3% of them into paid subscribers. And that math probably doesn't make sense in Sweden, but I know nothing of publishing here. We do have 300 subscribers in Sweden, which isn't bad. Though Norway has 400, and I think has half the population. Right? Norway has 600. Yeah, they also have more money, and we must be benefiting from North Sea oil exploration. Yeah.
So, what was your original vision with Jacobin, and how has that developed since?
Yeah, I would say my, often I think we make up stories after the fact to justify what we've done from day-to-day level. I would say my initial vision was just merely to create something, then to make it sustainable, to get like 100 subscribers. And I used, so one reason why funding a publication is sometimes easier than funding like a book publishing effort is that with magazines we get the money up front. So in other words, you shouldn't really have any cash flow issues because you get the money and then you have liabilities. So if you subscribe to Jacobin in the first year, you and 100 people subscribe, you know, that would be $3,000. But technically, I would have a subscription liability of my cost of goods sold per publication times my frequency. But what I did was just take the entire money and put it into one issue on the premise that we would just grow by at least 100 or 200 the next issue. So it was going line by line until we hit certain economies of scale. And so my immediate goals were just getting 100 subscribers in 90 days, you know? So it was like, all right, we just need 1 subscriber a day and we can make it sustainable and whatever else. Then my goal was, you know, so it's very discrete and small goals. And of course I had broader political goals, but what I wanted to do was just to make one intervention, just to make a small mark, shape something broader, take me and the group of people that were contributing to Jacobin and our ideas and make a wider impact. Then after that, we got more ambitious, especially as we saw that we were able to engage with the mainstream of American political debate, with like MSNBC and well, this is before Vox, but you know, those kind of liberal left or liberal outlets. But to be honest, it was just about creating the infrastructure, doing small things, doing it well, and then all of a sudden, more and more attention came and more subscribers and resources came almost by accident. So then you had to go back and kind of like create a history that explains where you're at by a series of like a broad sweeping conscious decisions as opposed to small little, you know, decisions. So it was basically rudderless, you know.
I was wondering, are you most interested in engaging liberal media or conservative media?
I would say liberal media, partially because, one, I think a large segment of their audience are, at the very least, American social democrats in a country in which that language does not exist. In that we have a social liberal party, we don't have a social democratic or labor-based party as our primary, you know, I guess center-left vehicle, because of accidents of history. But a lot of people who are Democrats, plus a lot of people who are currently alienated and not voting, is a potential future base of any left party or left movement. I also think, as a general style, liberals are more open to honest engagement, at least at this, you know, at this moment. I'm not saying something even deeper necessarily about conservatism across any age or period. It just, I think the fact that intellectually there's not much being produced on the American right. There's certain people like Rehan Salam and others at the National Review that we will occasionally engage with and write a response to, or vice versa. But it's there's not a lot going on there.
I can only imagine.
But, yeah, and it's not even. To be honest, there's even less conservatives that will openly defend Trump. There's not even like capital R reactionaries that have like a fleshed out worldview. But I have no problem with like platforming at least non-fascist parts of the right and engaging in debates. We often debate libertarians and others, but yeah, there's just not much going on there.
So would you say one of the aims of Jacobin is contributing to, or at least building, a mass movement?
Yeah, I mean, our ultimate political goal is, you can express in any sort of language you want. I probably shouldn't, but it's the old goal of the end of exploitation of person by person. So it's a world without class, right? And I think it's not just building a movement, but it's in the short term capturing and transforming state power, instituting a long series of reforms that aren't only good in and of themselves, but are cumulative and leads to more working class strength. Then those reforms will probably lead to some sort of crisis. In other words, we'll reach a point where capitalism has tolerated enough enough of socialism that we're making inroads into profitability, and there's all sorts of things spiraling, and we'll need to find a more left-wing way to resolve the crisis of social democracy, which would be, I think, deeper socializations to prevent capital's ability to withhold investment. And I think that in essence means, the socialization of the economy and the creation of an even more transformed state. So in a sense, if you want to use a very old language, you could call that a form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think for good reason we don't really use that language anymore, but the goal, I think, is in a radical democratic essence that, Marx, of course, meant the dictatorship not of a person or a clique or a party, but the dictatorship of an entire class. Not with the goal of necessarily valorizing workers or the working class, but in fact abolishing the condition of oppression that makes you, a worker, which is being subjected to the domination and exploitation of others.
So how broad can your magazine become in terms of its socialist policies? Would you say you have a general kind of democratic socialist party line, so to speak, or is it a space for where Marxists, Leninists can hobnob with social liberals?
So I would say that it's not a line, it's a box. And so in other words, you have to define what's outside the parameters of acceptable debate, but you don't have to define exactly what the stance and everything is. So Jacobin is an anti-Stalinist publication, so we oppose parts of the left that would want to impose a party state that look favorably at kind of authoritarian forms of socialism. We believe in certain rights that are often called liberal rights, that of course were won through hard struggle, the right of free association, of speech, of assembly, and others. And I think that's an important distinguishing point. We can, of course, publish on particular writers that don't subscribe to our whole vision. So in the United States, for example, one of our major struggles around Medicare for all. So we publish people who want to see the decommodification of 1/6 of our economy. Now, I don't necessarily need to have that person also believe in the decommodification of the rest of the 5/6 of the economy, but the publication as a whole has to have that view. But I think you could divide Jacobin into kind of three sorts of pieces. The vast majority of pieces are moral criticisms of capitalism, kind of explaining the inequalities in the world and explaining how capitalism is at the root of many of them, not necessarily all of them, but many of them. Another set of pieces would be on strategy, on how, in other words, we enact reforms and change the world. And then last minority pieces, because they're hard to write and they're speculative, is on what kind of world we could build. And Marxists have a long time derided kind of visions of the future as writing cookshops for the, recipes for the, oh my God, I'm butchering the code. Recipes for cookshops of the future. And The idea, in other words, was that if socialism is a truly democratic movement, then obviously some future generation of workers, when they are in that position, will of course decide what society will look like. So we shouldn't be like the utopian socialists of the early 19th century and just write it ahead of time for them. But I think, in fact, people today don't just believe that another world isn't politically possible. They don't believe that another world is technically possible, or a better world is. And they have fairly good reason to not believe that, considering the tremendous failure of planned economies, particularly the command economies of the Eastern Bloc, which, were pretty good at certain stages and like catch up to in rudimentary levels to the industrial West, but became grossly inefficient after that. So I think it is important to ask questions about to what extent do we need markets? What, in other words, do we oppose in capitalism, and what could we live with? So, for example, I think that there are certain calculation problems that you probably need, at least in spheres of consumer goods, markets for. But beyond that, I think there's also probably incentive questions that you might need for markets and firms that could fail in. But I also think the penalty for failure should be radically different, in that if the vast majority of society is decommodified, then your firm goes out of business and you're not destitute, you're bouncing back on the cushion of a welfare state, and you're also free to exit the workplace, so not just have voice within it. So I think, in other words, my vision of socialism is kind of, which I think is really important to articulate to people, is worker control of the means of production plus a generous welfare state, not unlike what you saw in social democracy. And the political sphere, multi-party democracy, a mix of direct democracy, but also probably a huge sphere for representative democracy. I think to a large extent, parliament might be the form of a socialist politics, and not kind of dreams we used to have, like a Soviet democracy. So I think, in other words, we should all have in our minds tentative blueprints, and we should all think hard about ways in which there needs to be a socialist theory of politics after capitalism, not just a theory of politics to seize power. So what would a socialist theory of jurisprudence be like, and so on. And I think that that's a necessity for the left. So that's a very minor part of what we do, but I think we should do more of it.
What are the ties between journalism and activism for you? Or how does your journalism inflect or affect activism?
So I think that we obviously do have an impact on informing activists and people in movements, or letting people connect in struggles that seem apart, and also giving people a broader framework to understand struggles and to inject them with a wider layer of class consciousness. But I think this should be indirect, in that I think that a good publication like Jacobin, which is kind of like a journal masquerading as a magazine, even though online we're more like a popular magazine, should be a step removed from politics. So in other words, if a Labour Party government comes to power in the UK, this is a party, and especially a Labour left, that we've engaged with for years. We published Jeremy Corbyn in associate publication of ours, published John McDonnell, we published members of his staff. We would need to be able to be extremely critical and also have a broader perspective that thinks not just about what kind of immediate propagandistic support the government needs in the next year or two, but what the socialist movement as a whole needs in 5, 10, 15 years to better understand what's happening and better understand developments. So I think that's So I think, in other words, there should be a separation, and activists are going to pick up what they're going to pick up in the publication, but we can't think about, we have to, I guess, be a step removed from politics, or from that kind of day-to-day politics, but indirectly, obviously, affect and shape.
It's a difficult balance.
Well,
in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in other words, I think that there are certain publications that at different times will be accountable to a party, right? Accountable to kind of a distinct kind of line. But I think that a lot of our goal today is building an oppositional politics in a very broad sense, and thinking about keeping ideas alive for when they're useful in the future. And that was the initial goal of Jacobin. And you could say that socialism is growing in the US, but it's hard to say whether at the beginning, middle, or end of a story. And I think at the very least, let's say socialism was a patient on life support with its pulse dying in the US. We kind of have restored the pulse and stabilized the situation a bit, but we're nowhere near running, much less walking, right? And even with Jacobin, I think that Jacobin's current circulation of 40,000, I think we could probably peak somewhere 50, 60,000, but Jacobin isn't a publication. It's a very large niche publication that will hopefully influence broader currents and future publications that will be more kind of mass mainstream publications. So if you just get too subordinated in what movements want, or from pressures from individual activists, or even from certain organizations, then I think you aren't doing your mission well in the long term. And I think there has to be some force that is able to ask hard questions that might be politically difficult or unpalatable today.
So I know you publish books with Verso a few times a year, right? Do you have to do everything in order to be
No, you don't have to do books. I think in fact we'd be better off if we just published one publication and did it very well and at a high volume. And that's traditionally what our model has been. You figure out how to do one thing, like publishing online articles, and you just figure out how to do it more efficiently, and then you just do it in a high volume. And now we grew massively from 2016 to 2017, and then we somewhat stagnated just because we went from around 16,000 subscribers to almost 40,000 subscribers. But since then, we've been steady. It's been very difficult to even maintain that base. So we launched Catalyst, a journal, a more academic-based journal, partially because, I mean, this is a very crass way to put it, but it's like a segmented market, right? It's like we could influence people who are in academia, and we could probably charge a little bit more, and we could actually make a low print run circulation journal sustainable, right? And a few of our efforts have been like that. But there's a reason why we don't do audio, we don't do much video. We do very limited audio, and we do almost no video, just because we're not equipped to do audio or video. So in the UK, Navarra is great at doing audio and video. We're great at producing print publications and doing things at scale with an online publication. So I think it's best to do less. Well, I didn't mean to rhyme. I was unfortunate, sorry.
It's best to do less.
Yes.
So you're not planning on expanding?
So we are doing franchises, but even this is so we have a Jacobin Italia that's already launched. And we also have affiliates that are developing in Germany and in Brazil. But with these, that's a classic kind of franchise model. We don't have to do much work. We just offer our articles for translation, and we kind of give them a broad guide, like an operations guide about how to best and most efficiently make a publication. Then it's up to them to run it independently with some limited oversight. And that makes sense, especially in language markets that are, not have low levels of English proficiency. So, or at least like the Germans obviously speak lots of English, but wouldn't bother reading it, and or the way elsewhere in Northern Europe, people do subscribe and read Jacobin. So I think that makes sense, but yeah, I think the danger is always feeling like you have to be like a multimedia company that does a million things, when in fact we are in the field of niche publishing with slightly growing journals enmeshed in slightly growing movements. So there's no need for us to pretend to be like CNN and have reporters videotaping things and things like that, especially because we can't afford to do it. So I think the goal, in other words, is very unglamorous. It's to get from 40 to 50, and then to slowly grow, and then maybe conditions will change so that we'll make another leap ahead to maybe 100,000 or something like that in terms of our circulation. But you can't bet on that. In fact, we budget to actually decline, just to be safe.
This is kind of circling back to my original question, the one that started all this. But you said socialism is stabilizing and socialism has a pulse now in America, right?
Mm-hmm.
How come?
Well, there's a variety of reasons. I think one is, it's impossible to separate objective and subjective factors. I think it is important that not just Jacobin, but other parts of the left, when the left was weak, put democratic socialism back alive as the word for the left of liberal opposition. So I think we did play a role. I think beyond that, there's the freak accident of history that is Bernie Sanders getting politicized in the 1960s in the Young People's Socialist League, then becoming eventually an independent senator in a very small state, but because of how undemocratic the US political system is, small state senators actually have a lot of power. So a couple 100,000 people can vote for someone who then become more nationally known, and then he could run for president. And because he has this weird background, he's describing democratic socialism to people, but he's describing it, in a kind of watered down way that just seems like common sense to most people, or at least large segments of the country that feel alienated from both parties. So when we were up canvassing for Sanders, we as individuals, in New Hampshire, for instance, we were doing best in areas that were loaded with moderates and conservatives. Because in the US, to be a moderate, for example, it just means that you associate liberalism with the Democratic Party, you don't really like them. You associate conservatism with the Republican Party, you don't really like them, so you just say you're a moderate. So there was wide appeal to our politics. And I think if your politics are simple and comprehensible enough, there should be. And I think that did matter, but also more broadly, the right had been using socialism as a slur against even the most moderate of reforms. So when most young people in the United States say that they support socialism over capitalism, and polling after polling, they say this, it's impossible to know what they actually mean, but chances are they were just referring to any sort of welfare state reform. And if you're living lives that are stressful and precarious, you see capitalism as kind of the dog-eat-dog status quo. You see socialism as any sort of small healthcare reform that will make things more affordable for you, or relief from debt or whatever else, then obviously you're apt to be more favorable to socialism. And then from that starting point, we can actually start to fill it with content. But I wouldn't underestimate Sanders, and obviously then there was Occupy, Black Lives Matter, the Wisconsin protests, and these all reminded, I think, people of the power of mass action, and helped repoliticize the US. So it's all these factors, and I don't know what we should foreground. I would say probably, I hate to foreground a presidential electoral campaign, but I think the Sanders effect is really hard to underestimate, partially because when Trump won and Clinton lost, it actually led to alert to the left in large segments of the country. And I think if Sanders wasn't there in that race, there wouldn't have been this articulated alternative on the left.
So do you think the future of socialism in the US is based in or around electoral politics?
I think that electoral politics is a shortcut, but it's a shortcut we need to pursue. So if you were to ask me 5 years ago, I would have gave you a very orthodox Marxist answer. I would have said that elections are important, but largely for propagandistic reasons, and we need to use energy from elections to build our class organization by supporting movements and raising the level of class struggle and consciousness, and then eventually this slow building in civil society will manifest itself into a real electoral program and movement that could, actually transform the state and not just electing an individual. I still broadly believe in that, but I do think that with Sanders, with Corbyn, we have a shortcut afforded to us where we could immediately capture the bully pulpit of the presidency or the office of prime minister. And from that bully pulpit, we might be able to wield executive power and also speak to voters and to working class people in such a way that we speed up the reconstruction of kind of our class base. So can you imagine, for example, Sanders, a President Sanders telling Americans that they have the right to unionize, connecting with extra parliamentary kind of networks and encouraging people to assemble in constituent assemblies and talk about their problems, and in other words, using the state to open up a space, even though we won't have Congress. That's another tricky thing about the US, in that if you were to translate into maybe your political system of what a Sanders presidency would mean, it would mean a extreme minority government. It would mean running with literally 20 MPs on your side, except you don't need, you can't get ousted. You don't need to pass a budget, whatever else. Like in the same way, it's a presidential system. So what can we do, in other words, through executive order, and what we could do to encourage, to be in opposition even when we're in power? And I think this is one thing Trump has actually done pretty well by his own standards, which is he's both in power but not willing to accept the responsibility for anything that happens legislatively or otherwise. And also, to be honest, we always talk about how disgusting it is that Trump is like catering to the far right and saying, oh, there's good people in Charlottesville and whatever else. But can you imagine a social democrat being that nice to the extra parliamentary left? I think a Sanders presidency would have to do some of those things, but the mirror image, of it.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. This was weird. It was almost like a TED Talk or something.
Oh my god.
That's sad. Yeah.
It was pretty interesting.
No,